The year is around 1478 BC. Egypt is the most powerful civilization on Earth, and a woman named Hatshepsut has just seized control of the whole thing. Here's what made that so radical. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not just the ruler, the pharaoh was considered a living god, a male living god. That was the entire cultural framework. No woman had held that role in centuries. Hatshepsut walked into that framework and rewrote it. She declared herself pharaoh, put on the fake ceremonial beard that male rulers wore, had herself depicted in sculptures as a man, and then just got to work. Under her 20-year reign, Egypt flourished. She sent trading expeditions south to a region called Punt in today's Somalia or Eritrea and came back with frankincense trees, ebony, gold, and exotic animals. She built one of the most stunning temples in ancient Egypt, which still stands today. She commissioned more monuments and statues during her reign than most pharaohs managed in twice the time. And then she died. And the pharaoh who came after her, likely her stepson, apparently could not handle the fact that a woman had been that successful. He spent years trying to destroy her legacy. He had her name carved off monuments. Her statues were smashed and buried in a pit. Her image was replaced with his. He wanted history to forget she had ever existed. He almost pulled it off. For about 3,000 years, historians barely knew her name. But here's what he could not have predicted. In 1903, archaeologists in Egypt found a pit filled with broken statues. When they pieced the fragments together, they found Hatshepsut literally dug back up out of erasure 3,000 years later. Today, she is recognized as one of the greatest rulers Egypt ever produced. You cannot bury what is built to last. Now jump forward about 2,800 years, and you find Mansa Musa, a man whose wealth was so extreme it broke the concept of wealth. Mansa Musa was the emperor of the Mali Empire in the 14th century. Historians who try to calculate his net worth in today's terms often just give up and write incalculable. The numbers stop making sense. One estimate puts it at around $400 billion. Others say it is more than that. In 1324, he made a pilgrimage to Mecca, and he did not travel light. He brought around 60,000 people with him. Attendants, soldiers, scholars, servants, camel handlers. He brought an estimated 27 tons of gold. As his procession passed through Cairo, he started giving gold away. To everyone, beggars in the street, shopkeepers, officials. He was so generous, so casual about it, that he flooded the entire Egyptian gold market in a matter of weeks. The price of gold across Egypt and the Middle East crashed. It took local economies more than 10 years to stabilize. He did not mean to cause an economic crisis. He was just being generous by the standards of someone who had more gold than any market could absorb. But here is the part of Mansa Musa's story that almost nobody talks about. While the world remembers the gold, what Mali actually was under his rule is even more impressive. Timbuktu, a city in his empire, became one of the great academic centers of the medieval world. Scholars came from across the Muslim world to study there. The city had universities, libraries, and tens of thousands of manuscripts on science, law, mathematics, and astronomy. Some of those manuscripts are still being preserved and studied today. The gold was just the show. The city of learning was the real legacy. Now we move to someone who had none of Mansa Musa's wealth and none of Hatshepsut's inherited position. Someone who built her resistance entirely out of intelligence, nerve, and an absolute refusal to accept the way things were going. Queen Nzinga ruled the kingdoms of Nendogo and Matamba in what is now Angola in the 17th century. She was dealing with a situation that most African rulers of her era eventually lost. The Portuguese were coming, colonizing everything, and feeding the slave trade with captured Africans. Most kingdoms either submitted or were destroyed. Nzinga did neither. She was a military strategist, a diplomat, and a psychological warrior. She made alliances when she needed them, fought wars when she had to, and moved her base of operations multiple times rather than give the Portuguese a fixed enemy to defeat. There is one story about her that I keep coming back to. She was invited to negotiate with a Portuguese governor. When she arrived, she found that the governor was seated in a chair and no chair had been provided for her. This was deliberate. A power move. The message was, "You stand before me." Nzinga looked at her attendants, gestured to one of them, and the attendant got on their hands and knees. Nzinga sat on the attendant's back. She then conducted the entire negotiation seated, at eye level with the governor, as an equal. Think about what that moment required. She walked into a room designed to humiliate her and instantly turned it into a demonstration of her dominance using nothing but her own composure and quick thinking. Historians debate whether every detail of this story is perfectly accurate, but the broader pattern of Nzinga's life is completely documented. She outmaneuvered the Portuguese for decades, dying at around 80 years old, still in command of her kingdom, having never surrendered. Now let us talk about Shaka, a man who turned childhood rejection into one of the most devastating military forces Southern Africa had ever seen. Shaka was born in the late 1700s, the son of a Zulu chief. But his parents were not properly married by Zulu customs, which made him illegitimate in the eyes of his people. He and his mother were mocked, ostracized, eventually banished. He grew up as an outsider among people who were supposed to be his family. When Shaka finally came to power over the Zulu in the early 1800s, he had something most rulers never develop: the deep, specific anger of someone who was rejected by the very system he was now running. He rebuilt the Zulu military completely. New weapons, new formations, new training methods that were brutal by any standard. He turned the Zulu from a small chiefdom into a regional superpower in less than a decade. His military campaigns reshaped the entire landscape of southeastern Africa. Tens of thousands of people died, entire communities were displaced, the whole region was reorganized around the power of the Zulu state. Shaka's story does not have a clean ending. He became increasingly erratic and violent in his later years. Some historians believe something broke in him after his mother died. He was eventually killed by his own brothers in 1828. But what he built in a short period of time, starting from almost nothing, is still studied in military strategy courses today. Because the ability to look at a broken system and rebuild it from scratch, that kind of thinking is rare in any era, in any place in the world. Nelson Mandela, number 1. By a wide margin. In a poll of thousands of people, most people know the outline: 27 years in prison, first black president of South Africa, symbol of forgiveness and reconciliation. That is the version that gets repeated. But there is a specific moment in this story that I think gets skipped over, and it is actually the most important part. When Mandela walked out of prison in February 1990, South Africa was not waiting for him with flowers and a peaceful transition. The country was on the edge of a civil war. The ANC, his own organization, had a younger generation of members who had been fighting and dying for decades while he was in prison. They were not interested in reconciliation. They wanted justice, by force if necessary. The apartheid government was equally terrified. What would a black majority government mean for the white minority population? Would there be revenge killings, land seizures, chaos? Mandela stepped into that pressure from both sides, his own people pushing him toward confrontation. The other side braced for it, and he chose a third path that neither side expected. He sat down with the apartheid government and negotiated a peaceful transfer of power. He told his own supporters that revenge would destroy the country they were fighting to build. He told the apartheid leaders that their safety would be protected in a democratic South Africa. And the remarkable thing is, it mostly worked. South Africa did not collapse into civil war. The transition happened. It was imperfect. It is still imperfect. But the country survived a moment that by every historical precedent should have torn it apart. That was not luck. That was one man using political intelligence and moral authority to hold a country together by sheer force of will. Then there is Kwame Nkrumah, the name that came in second on that list, and the one most people outside West Africa barely recognize. Nkrumah led Ghana to become the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence from colonial rule in 1957. But he was not just building a free Ghana, he was trying to build a free Africa. One unified continent, one government, one power that could sit at the table with the United States, the Soviet Union, Europe, and be taken seriously. He believed and argued this in speech after speech, that African countries trying to win power one by one, separately, would always be outmaneuvered by larger powers. That unity was not just an ideal, it was a survival strategy. He was overthrown in a coup in 1966 while he was abroad. He never returned to Ghana as a leader. He died in exile in 1972. But the African Union exists. The dream of continental cooperation that he spent his life fighting for is still alive, imperfect, slow, contested, but alive. Ideas do not die when the person carrying them does. And then we get to Fela Kuti, the one who still genuinely shocks me. Fela Anikulapo Kuti was a Nigerian musician. He created Afrobeats, taking jazz, highlife, and traditional Yoruba rhythms and building something entirely new, something that is now one of the most globally listened to music genres in the world. But that is almost the least interesting thing about him. Fela was arrested over 200 times by Nigerian authorities. He used every single arrest as material, turning them into songs, into public statements, into proof of exactly what he was singing about. The government wanted to silence him. Instead, every time they touched him, they handed him another verse. In 1977, soldiers raided his compound, a place he had declared the independent Calcutta Republic, beat his musicians, burned the building, and threw his 77-year-old mother out of a second-floor window. She died from her injuries months later. Fela's response was to write a song about it, record it, release it, and then carry his mother's coffin to the gates of the military barracks and leave it there. That is not a metaphor. He literally did that. He ran for president of Nigeria while in prison. He married 27 women in a single ceremony as a political statement about African tradition versus Western influence. He lived on his own terms, loudly and completely, until the end. He died in 1997 of complications from AIDS, a disease he had denied having. Over 1 million people came to his funeral in Lagos. More than 25 years later, his music is still everywhere. Sampled by Drake, performed at Coachella, taught in music schools. The Nigerian government that spent decades trying to destroy him now celebrates him as a national icon. That is the power of someone who absolutely refused to stop. Hatshepsut, Mansa Musa, Queen Nzinga, Shaka Zulu, Kwame Nkrumah, Nelson Mandela, Fela Kuti. Different eras, different countries, different tools. Some had armies, some had gold, some had music. Some had just a clear mind in a room full of people trying to diminish them. But every single one of them did the same essential thing. They looked at the world as they found it, decided it was not good enough, and changed it. That is what this continent has been doing for thousands of years. Not waiting, not surviving, changing things. I said at the start that I felt embarrassed when I first discovered how much I had missed. I still feel that sometimes when I find another name, another story, another empire that should have been in every classroom, there is so much more. But that embarrassment is also fuel, because now you know these names. And knowing them changes something in how you see Africa, and maybe in how you see what is possible for the people who come next. The stories are there. They always were. You just have to be willing to look. Subscribe because there are 100 more stories like these waiting for you.